My name is Zara Brennan, and the day I was told I couldn't attend my own father's funeral was the same day I discovered I owned the entire funeral home chain that would be hosting it. They thought they were shutting me out of his final goodbye, but what they didn't know was that Vincent Brennan had left me everything they thought belonged to them. Every chapel, every hearse, every single property, in the Eternal Rest Memorial Services empire that had been in our family for 3 generations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning it all unraveled, I was standing in my Hartford apartment kitchen, stirring honey into my tea and watching the rain streak down the window. My phone rang at exactly 7:43, and Corinne's voice cut through the speaker like glass through silk. She didn't bother with pleasantries or condolences, even though my father had only been gone for 18 hours. "Zara, we need to discuss the arrangements," she said, her tone already suggesting this conversation wouldn't go the way I hoped. "The family has decided that given the circumstances of your relationship with Vincent over these past few years, it would be best if you didn't attend the service. We want to keep things peaceful and focused on celebrating his life properly." I set my mug down so carefully that it didn't make a sound against the granite counter. The rain outside seemed to grow louder, filling the silence while I processed what she'd just said. My stepmother of 12 years had just uninvited me from my own father's funeral, and she'd done it with the casual efficiency of someone canceling a dinner reservation. The drive to Millbrook took 47 minutes, and I spent every one of them replaying Corinne's words. "The circumstances of your relationship with Vincent." As if the distance between my father and me had been my choice alone. As if I hadn't spent the last 3 years trying to bridge a gap that seemed to widen every time I reached across it. The Connecticut countryside blurred past my windshield, all autumn gold and deep red maples, the kind of scenery that should have been comforting but felt like a mockery of the turmoil churning in my chest. Millbrook hadn't changed since I was a child. The same white colonial houses lined Maple Street, their black shutters and red brick chimneys standing like sentries against the gray October sky. I drove past the elementary school where I'd learned to read, past the diner where Dad used to take me for chocolate chip pancakes on Saturday mornings, past the library where I'd hidden during the awkward years after he remarried. Everything looked smaller now, but the weight of memory made the air feel thick as honey. The Eternal Rest Memorial Services building sat at the end of Charter Oak Avenue like a grand Victorian dame holding court. 3 stories of deep blue clapboard and white trim, with a wraparound porch and stained glass windows that caught the light even on overcast days. My great-grandfather had built this place in 1924, and 4 generations of Brennans had walked these halls, comforting the grieving and honoring the departed. I'd grown up thinking I'd be the 5th. I parked across the street and sat in my car for several minutes, watching people move in and out of the building. Some I recognized from my childhood, neighbors and family friends who'd aged into softer versions of themselves. Others were strangers, probably colleagues of my father's from the Connecticut Funeral Directors Association. They all moved with that particular gentle urgency that funeral preparations require, carrying flower arrangements and speaking in hushed tones. Through the large front windows I could see the main chapel where my father's casket would rest tomorrow. The same room where we'd said goodbye to my grandmother 8 years ago, where countless families had gathered to mourn their loved ones under the soft glow of those amber glass light fixtures. The thought that I wouldn't be allowed to sit in those familiar pews tomorrow, wouldn't be able to say my own goodbye in the place that held so much of our family history, made my throat close tight. My phone buzzed against the passenger seat. A text from Derek, my half-brother, sent to what I assumed was a family group chat I'd been removed from. Flowers arrived. Corinne wants the white roses moved to the side chapel, and the lilies arranged around the casket. Timeline still on track for tomorrow at 2. I scrolled up and saw dozens of messages from the past day, all logistics and arrangements, all happening without me. My own family had created a planning committee that didn't include the grief counselor daughter, who'd spent years learning how to help people navigate loss. The irony wasn't lost on me. For the past 6 years, I'd built my career around helping people process death and grief. guiding them through the most difficult experiences of their lives. I'd sat in countless therapy sessions, holding space for clients as they worked through complicated relationships with deceased parents, unresolved conflicts that death had made permanent. I knew all the textbook wisdom about complicated grief, about family systems and inherited trauma. But knowing the theory and living the reality were entirely different animals. I climbed out of my car and walked toward the building, not entirely sure what I planned to do once I got inside. The October air carried the scent of burning leaves, and that particular crispness that comes right before the first frost. My heels clicked against the brick walkway, the same path I'd skipped down as a 6-year-old when Mom would bring me to visit Dad at work. Back then, this place had felt magical rather than morbid, full of flowers and quiet conversations and the kind of reverent calm that made everything seem important. The brass nameplate beside the front door read, "Vincent R. Brennan, Director," in elegant script lettering. Seeing his name there, knowing it would need to be changed soon, hit me harder than I expected. My father had been 43 when he took over from my grandfather. He'd modernized the business while preserving its character, adding 2 satellite locations and building relationships with hospices throughout the region. This place had been his life's work, his legacy, his identity, and tomorrow they'd celebrate that legacy without me. The front door opened before I could reach for the handle, and Natalie stepped onto the porch. My half-sister looked exactly like our father, all sharp angles and thoughtful eyes, but she'd inherited Corinne's ability to make her expressions completely unreadable. She wore a black wool dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and her blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon that wouldn't dare show a strand out of place even in the October wind. "Zara," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "I didn't expect to see you here today." "I wanted to see the arrangements," I replied, matching her measured tone. He was still my father, regardless of what Corinne thinks about my attendance tomorrow. Natalie glanced back through the glass doors, and I could see her calculating something behind those pale blue eyes. She's inside with the florist, finalizing the display setup. Derek's in the office handling the guest book and memorial cards. Maybe now isn't the best time for a visit. The careful diplomacy in her voice reminded me of all the times over the years when she'd tried to navigate between my relationship with Dad and her mother's obvious preference that I simply fade away. Natalie had never been cruel to me, but she'd never been brave enough to challenge the family dynamics that pushed me to the margins either. She was Switzerland in a war. One never wanted to fight. "When would be a better time?" I asked. "After you've buried him without me there?" Something flickered across her face then, maybe guilt, or maybe just discomfort. "You know it's not that simple, Zara. There's been so much tension, and Mom just wants tomorrow to be peaceful. She thinks having you there might create drama or upset people." "What people?" "The people who've known me since I was a child? The people who watched Dad teach me how to arrange flowers in the workroom downstairs? Or just the people who matter to Corinne?" Before Natalie could answer, the front door opened again and Derek appeared. My half-brother had always been the peacekeeper in our family, the one who tried to smooth over conflicts with jokes and subject changes. But today his usual easy smile was nowhere to be found. He looked tired, older than his 28 years, and there was something in his expression that made my stomach drop. "Zara, hey," he said, stepping between Natalie and me in that protective way he'd perfected over the years. "Listen, I'm really sorry about all this mess. You know how Mom gets when she's stressed, and planning a funeral is basically her worst nightmare scenario."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"Don't apologize for her, Derek. She's a grown woman who made a deliberate choice to exclude me from my own father's funeral. That's not stress talking, that's calculated cruelty." He winced at my words, but didn't deny them. "Maybe we can find a compromise. Maybe you could come to the graveside service instead, or we could arrange a private viewing for you beforehand." The fact that my own brother was negotiating the terms of my grief, offering me scraps of access to my father's farewell, made something cold and hard settle in my chest. This wasn't about logistics or stress or keeping the peace. This was about power and control, and the careful orchestration of a narrative that didn't include me. "I don't want your compromises," I said quietly. "I want to say goodbye to my father in the place where he spent his life's work, surrounded by the history he helped build. I want to sit in the front row like every other child who's lost a parent. I want to be treated like family, instead of an inconvenient reminder of his first marriage." Natalie and Derek exchanged a look that told me they'd rehearsed this conversation, that they'd discussed strategies for handling me and my unreasonable expectations. The thought that my own siblings had sat around planning how to manage my grief made me feel more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. "Zara," Natalie began, her voice taking on that patronizing tone people use when they think they're being reasonable. "You have to understand that Dad's relationship with you was complicated. He loved you, we all know that, but the way you pulled away after he and Mom got married, the way you criticized his choices and made family gatherings tense, it hurt him. He spent years trying to bridge that gap, and you kept pushing back. The revisionist history, in her words, took my breath away." She was rewriting our family story in real time, casting me as the difficult daughter who'd chosen distance over connection, who'd made my father's life harder instead of the other way around. It was a masterful manipulation, the kind that made me question my own memories even as I knew she was wrong. "I was 16 when he married your mother," I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "I was a grieving kid who'd lost her mother 2 years earlier, and instead of giving me time to adjust to a new family dynamic, everyone expected me to be grateful and well-adjusted immediately. When I struggled, when I acted like a normal teenager dealing with massive life changes, I was labeled as the problem." Derek shifted uncomfortably, and I could see that some part of him remembered those early years differently than the story Corinne had crafted over time. He'd been just 16 himself when his mother married my father, young enough to see past the careful narratives adults create to justify their choices. "That's not how it happened," Natalie said, but there was less certainty in her voice now. "Mom tried so hard to include you, to make you feel welcome. She planned family vacations and invited you to everything, but you always found reasons to be somewhere else. Your mother planned activities that she knew I wouldn't enjoy, with people who made it clear I didn't belong, and then acted hurt when I chose to opt out instead of sitting through another evening of being ignored or condescended to. She didn't want to include me, Natalie. She wanted to perform inclusion, while making sure I knew my place in the new hierarchy." The conversation was spiraling into familiar territory, the same circular arguments we'd been having for years. But something felt different this time, more final somehow. Maybe it was the gravity of the situation, the fact that Dad was gone and wouldn't be there to play referee anymore. Maybe it was the realization that without him, I truly had no place in this family structure they'd built around his absence. A car pulled up to the curb behind mine, and I watched as Uncle Pete climbed out of his ancient Honda Civic. Dad's younger brother had always been the family outsider, the one who'd chosen teaching over funeral directing, who'd married a woman Corinne didn't approve of, and who lived in a modest ranch house instead of a colonial mansion. Pete had been one of the few adults who'd consistently treated me with kindness during the difficult transition years, and seeing him now felt like spotting a lighthouse in a storm. "Zara, sweetheart," he said, walking up the path with his characteristic quick stride. "I was hoping I'd see you today. How are you holding up?" The genuine warmth in his voice, such a contrast to the careful politeness of my siblings, nearly undid the composure I'd been fighting to maintain. Uncle Pete had always seen through the family dynamics that others chose to ignore or enable. He'd been the one to call me when Dad was diagnosed with cancer, the one to update me on treatment progress when my stepmother decided those conversations were too sensitive for my ears. "I'm managing," I said, accepting his hug and breathing in the familiar scent of Old Spice and coffee that had defined him for as long as I could remember, though apparently I'm managing it from a distance, since I've been uninvited from tomorrow's service. Pete's expression darkened, and he looked between Natalie and Derek with obvious disapproval. "What do you mean, uninvited? Vincent was your father. Corinne thinks my presence would be disruptive," I explained, watching my siblings, faces for reactions. "She's concerned about maintaining a peaceful atmosphere and keeping the focus on celebrating Dad's life properly." Uncle Pete made a sound that was half laugh, half snort of disgust. That's the biggest load of garbage I've heard since your father told me he was selling the Hartford location to pay for Natalie's wedding. Vincent would be spinning in his grave if he knew his wife was trying to keep his eldest daughter away from his funeral. The comment about the Hartford location caught my attention, but before I could ask about it, Corinne herself appeared in the doorway. My stepmother had always been beautiful in that carefully maintained way that requires significant time and money to achieve. Today she wore a black suit that probably came from some boutique in West Hartford, and her silver hair was styled in the kind of perfect waves that don't move in the wind. But there was something brittle about her appearance, a tightness around her eyes that suggested the stress Derek had mentioned. "Peter," she said, her voice carrying that particular chill she reserved for family members who didn't fall in line with her plans. "I didn't realize you were coming by today. The family is trying to finalize arrangements, and we have a very tight schedule." "I'm sure you do," Pete replied, his tone matching hers for coolness. "I was just hearing about how you've decided to exclude Zara from Vincent's funeral. I have to say, Corinne, that's a new low, even for you." The tension on the porch became thick enough to cut with a knife. Natalie looked like she wanted to disappear into the Victorian woodwork, and Derek was doing that thing where he stared at his shoes and hoped conflict would resolve itself through the power of avoidance. But Uncle Pete stood his ground, his jaw set in the stubborn way that ran in the Brennan family genes. "This is hardly the time or place for family drama," Corinne said, but I could hear the uncertainty creeping into her voice. Uncle Pete had a way of cutting through her carefully constructed authority that clearly made her uncomfortable. "I'm simply trying to ensure that Vincent's memorial service honors his memory appropriately." "And you think excluding his daughter honors his memory? You think Vincent would have wanted Zara to be turned away from his funeral because you've decided she doesn't fit into your version of the perfect grieving family?" Before Corinne could answer, a woman I didn't recognize appeared behind her in the doorway. She was probably in her 50s, wearing a navy blue dress and carrying a leather portfolio that suggested professional authority. Her presence seemed to shift something in the dynamic, and I watched as my stepmother's carefully controlled expression flickered for just a moment. "Mrs. Brennan," the woman said, addressing Corinne directly, "I'm sorry to interrupt, but we really do need to discuss the documentation issues we discovered this morning. The probate questions are more complicated than we initially thought, and there are some inheritance matters that require immediate attention." My heart started beating faster without my conscious permission. Something about the woman's tone, the way she'd emphasized documentation issues and inheritance matters, set off alarm bells in my head. I'd spent enough time around legal professionals in my work to recognize the particular gravity that comes with unexpected complications. Corinne's face went through several subtle changes, settling into an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't her usual controlled authority or even her practiced grief. It was something closer to fear, carefully masked but unmistakably present. She glanced at me, then at Uncle Pete, then back at the woman with the portfolio. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation inside," Corinne suggested, her voice tight with tension. "Family business should remain private." But Uncle Pete wasn't having it. "If this concerns Vincent's estate, then Zara has every right to hear it. She's his daughter, regardless of how you feel about that fact." The woman with the portfolio looked between us all with the expression of someone who'd walked into a family drama she hadn't expected to navigate. "I'm Patricia Vale, the estate attorney. And actually, Mr. Brennan is correct. Miss Brennan should absolutely be present for this conversation, given the contents of the will we discovered this morning." The words hung in the October air like frost, sharp and crystalline, and impossible to ignore. Corinne's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup, and I could see Derek and Natalie exchanging confused glances. Whatever they'd expected to hear about Dad's estate, this clearly wasn't it. "What will?" I asked, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "Dad's will was read last week. Corinne inherited the house and the business, the kids got trust funds, and I received his personal effects and a small cash bequest." Patricia Vale's expression grew more serious, if that was possible. "That's exactly the problem, Miss Brennan. The will that was read last week was dated 3 years ago, but we've discovered a more recent document in your father's safety deposit box. A will dated just 6 months ago that significantly changes the distribution of assets." The porch seemed to tilt beneath my feet. 6 months ago, Dad had still been fighting his cancer diagnosis, still going through treatments that everyone hoped would give him more time. 6 months ago, he'd been lucid and determined and very much in control of his affairs. If he'd changed his will that recently, it meant he'd made deliberate choices about his legacy in the final months of his life. What kind of changes? Uncle Pete asked, and I could hear the protective edge in his voice. Patricia Vale looked directly at me when she answered. Miss Brennan, according to the updated will, you are the primary beneficiary of Eternal Rest Memorial Services. All 3 locations, all assets, equipment, and outstanding contracts. Your father left you the entire funeral home business. The world went completely silent. Not just quiet, but utterly absent of sound, as if someone had pressed a cosmic mute button on reality. I could see Derek's mouth moving, probably asking questions, and I could see the color draining from Corinne's face like water from a broken dam. But I couldn't hear anything over the roaring in my own ears. My father, the man who'd grown distant and complicated in the years since his remarriage, the man whose funeral I'd been banned from attending, had left me his life's work. The business that had defined the Brennan family for 3 generations, the Victorian building where I'd learned about dignity and service and the importance of honoring people's final chapters, all of it was mine. I looked up at the deep blue clapboard siding and white trim, at the stained glass windows that caught the light even on gray days, at the brass nameplate that would need to be changed. But this time, the change wouldn't erase the Brennan name. It would restore it to someone who'd never stopped loving this place, even when loving it from a distance felt like the only option. Tomorrow, Corinne had planned to bury my father and celebrate his legacy without me. But as I stood on that porch, watching my stepmother's carefully constructed world crumble in real time, I realized that Vincent Brennan had already ensured his real legacy would continue exactly as he'd intended. The daughter they'd tried to erase from the family story was about to inherit the family business. And suddenly, everything was about to change. The silence stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. I watched Corinne's face cycle through disbelief, anger, and something that looked dangerously close to panic. Derek had stopped moving entirely, frozen like a deer in headlights, while Natalie's mouth opened and closed without producing any sound. Only Uncle Pete seemed unsurprised, nodding slowly as if Patricia Vale had just confirmed something he'd suspected all along. That's impossible, Corinne finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Vincent would never have done that without discussing it with me. We were married for 12 years. I helped him build those satellite locations. I hosted every client dinner, every industry conference reception. I was his partner in everything. Patricia Vale opened her leather portfolio and withdrew a thick document bound in navy blue covers. Mrs. Brennan, I understand this comes as a shock, but the will is completely legitimate. It was witnessed by 2 independent parties, notarized by a licensed professional, and filed with the appropriate authorities. Your husband was very thorough in ensuring its validity. I found my voice somewhere in the chaos of thoughts spinning through my head. Can I see it? The attorney handed me the document, and I recognized my father's careful handwriting on the cover page immediately. He'd always written in the same precise script, whether he was signing death certificates or writing birthday cards. My hands shook slightly as I opened to the first page and began reading words that would reshape everything I thought I knew about my father's final months. I, Vincent Robert Brennan, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all previous wills and codicils and declare this to be my last will and testament. The formal language continued for several paragraphs, but my eyes jumped to the section labeled Distribution of Assets. To my daughter Zara Brennan, I leave the entirety of Eternal Rest Memorial Services, including all 3 locations, all equipment, vehicles, supplies, client contracts, and associated real estate properties. This bequest reflects my confidence in her ability to continue the family tradition of compassionate service to our community. The words swam on the page as I read them again, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My father hadn't just left me the business as an afterthought or consolation prize. He'd written an entire paragraph explaining his reasoning, describing his belief in my capabilities and his desire to see the Brennan legacy continue through me. It was more faith than he'd expressed in me during the entire 12 years since his remarriage. This can't be legally binding, Derek said, finally finding his voice. Dad was on heavy medications during his final months. Morphine affects judgment and decision-making. Any lawyer could challenge this on grounds of diminished capacity. Patricia Vale's expression remained professionally neutral, but I caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she'd dealt with this kind of denial before. Mr. Brennan, your father executed this will in March, nearly 6 months before his death and well before he required any significant pain management medications. We have medical records confirming his mental clarity at the time of signing. Additionally, he specifically included a clause addressing potential capacity challenges. She turned to a page near the back of the document and read aloud. Should any party attempt to contest this will on grounds of mental incapacity, I direct that the video recording of my testament explanation, made simultaneously with this document's execution, be presented as evidence of my clear intent and reasoning. My stepmother looked like she might faint. The carefully constructed composure she'd maintained through my father's illness, through the funeral planning, through this entire confrontation, was cracking visibly. Video recording? Vincent never mentioned making any video. Your husband was quite deliberate about documenting his wishes, Patricia continued. He expressed concern that his decisions might be challenged, and took extensive precautions to ensure his intent would be honored. Uncle Pete cleared his throat, drawing our attention back to him. Corinne, you need to understand something. Vincent talked to me about this decision months ago. He wasn't making impulsive choices or acting out of spite. He spent weeks thinking through the implications and discussing his reasoning. His reasoning? Corinne's voice rose several octaves. What possible reasoning could justify giving our family business to someone who hasn't worked in the funeral industry a day in her life? Someone who criticized his choices for years and barely spoke to him toward the end? The accusation hit me like a physical blow, not because it was entirely untrue, but because it reduced the complexity of my relationship with my father to a simple narrative of ingratitude and abandonment. It was easier for Corinne to believe I'd been the problem than to acknowledge the role she'd played in creating the distance between us. I barely spoke to him because every conversation became a battlefield, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Every phone call turned into criticism about my career choices, my living situation, my failure to attend family events that made me feel like an unwelcome guest. I stopped calling as much because it hurt too much to hear the disappointment in his voice every time we talked. Natalie stepped forward, her lawyer instincts apparently kicking in despite the personal nature of the situation. Even if the will is valid, Zara doesn't have any experience running a funeral home. The business requires specialized licenses, industry relationships, ongoing client commitments. You can't just hand over a complex operation to someone who works in mental health counseling. Actually, I said quietly, I do have experience in the funeral industry. I worked here every summer during high school and college, remember? I helped with intake procedures, client services, administrative tasks. I know how the business operates, how the licensing works, how to coordinate with cemeteries and clergy and medical examiners. Dad made sure I learned every aspect of the operation. The memory of those summer jobs felt bittersweet now. At the time, I'd assumed Dad was just keeping me busy and teaching me responsibility. But looking back, I could see he'd been methodically training me in every facet of the business. He'd explained the importance of treating each family with dignity, shown me how to navigate the delicate balance between business efficiency and emotional support, taught me to see death not as an ending but as a transition that required careful attention and respect. That was 15 years ago, Derek protested. The industry has changed completely since then. Digital record keeping, new regulations, different insurance requirements. You'd be in over your head within a week. Patricia Vale consulted her notes and spoke up again. Mr. Brennan, your father anticipated these concerns as well. The will includes provisions for a 6-month transition period, during which Mrs. Corinne Brennan will remain as interim manager while Ms. Zara completes any necessary licensing updates and familiarizes herself with current operations. Additionally, he's arranged for consultation services with Morrison Funeral Directors in Hartford to provide ongoing support during the transition. The level of detail in my father's planning was staggering. He hadn't just decided to leave me the business. He'd created a comprehensive plan for ensuring its successful continuance. Morrison Funeral Directors was one of the most respected firms in Connecticut, known for their ethical practices and innovative approaches to modern funeral services. Having them as consultants would provide credibility and expertise that even Corinne couldn't dismiss. "What about the house?" Corinne asked, her voice now carrying a desperate edge. "What about the other assets? The investment accounts, the life insurance policies, the retirement funds?" Patricia turned several pages in the document. "You inherit the family residence and all its contents, as well as Mr. Brennan's personal investment portfolio and life insurance benefits. The children each receive educational trust funds as previously established. However, all business-related assets, including the commercial properties housing the funeral homes, transfer to Ms. Brennan." I watched the calculation happening behind my stepmother's eyes. She was trying to determine whether the residential and investment assets would be enough to maintain her lifestyle, whether she could continue living as the widow of a successful funeral director without actually controlling the source of that success. The house was valuable, certainly, but the real wealth in my father's estate was tied up in the business properties and ongoing revenue streams. "This is ridiculous," Derek said, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "Zara doesn't even live in Millbrook anymore. She has a whole life in Hartford, clients who depend on her. How is she supposed to manage 3 funeral homes from 40 minutes away?" The question was reasonable, and it highlighted the practical challenges I'd be facing if I chose to accept this inheritance. My grief counseling practice was thriving, with a caseload of clients who'd taken months or years to build trust with me. I couldn't simply abandon them to take over a business I'd never expected to own. But as I stood there looking at the building where 4 generations of my family had served their community, I felt something stirring that I hadn't experienced in years. Purpose, maybe, or destiny, or just the simple recognition that this place had always felt like home even when the people inside it didn't. "I could relocate my practice," I heard myself saying. "Millbrook doesn't have any licensed grief counselors, and there's clearly a need for those services in a community served by 3 funeral homes. I could integrate therapeutic support into the funeral home offerings, provide comprehensive care for families dealing with loss." The idea emerged fully formed, as if I'd been unconsciously planning this possibility for years. Funeral homes were increasingly recognizing the importance of grief support beyond the immediate services, and my background in mental health counseling could fill a genuine gap in the market. It would be innovative, meaningful work that honored both my professional training and my family's legacy. Uncle Pete smiled for the first time since this conversation began. "Vincent would have loved that idea. He always said the business should evolve to meet families' changing needs. Combining traditional funeral services with professional grief counseling would set Eternal Rest apart from every other funeral home in the region." "She can't just waltz in here and change everything Dad built," Natalie said, her composure finally cracking. "This business has operated successfully for generations following established practices. Experimental programs and untested approaches could destroy our reputation and drive away long-standing clients. Or they could position the business as a leader in compassionate, comprehensive end-of-life services." I countered. "The funeral industry is changing whether we acknowledge it or not. Families want more personalized, meaningful experiences. They want support that extends beyond the day of the service. Integrating grief counseling isn't experimental, it's responsive to what people actually need." Patricia Vale closed her portfolio and looked around our group with the weary expression of someone who'd mediated numerous estate disputes. "I understand this news is overwhelming for everyone involved. However, the legal reality is clear. Miss Brennan is now the owner of Eternal Rest Memorial Services, effective immediately. The transition period allows for adjustment and preparation, but the fundamental ownership change is not negotiable." Corinne straightened her shoulders and seemed to pull her scattered composure back together through sheer force of will. "Fine. If Vincent chose to leave the business to Zara, then that's his decision to live with. But I want it on record that I believe this choice will ultimately harm the reputation and financial stability of everything he worked to build. And when this experiment fails, I won't be responsible for cleaning up the mess." The dismissal in her voice was familiar, the same tone she'd used whenever I'd expressed opinions or aspirations that didn't align with her vision of appropriate behavior. But this time, her disapproval couldn't diminish or redirect my path. My father had given me something she couldn't take away, the legal authority to prove her wrong. I'll need access to all business records, financial statements, client files, and operational procedures, I said, addressing Patricia directly. I'll also need keys to all 3 locations and contact information for current staff members. If I'm going to honor Dad's faith in me, I need to understand exactly what I'm inheriting. The attorney nodded approvingly. I have prepared a comprehensive transition package, including all the materials you've mentioned. We can schedule a meeting tomorrow to review everything in detail and begin the formal transfer process. Tomorrow. The day of my father's funeral, the service I'd been banned from attending just hours earlier. The irony was almost poetic. While my family gathered to mourn Vincent Brennan's death, I'd be meeting with lawyers to inherit his life's work. While they celebrated his memory according to Corinne's carefully orchestrated plan, I'd be discovering the true extent of the legacy he'd chosen to entrust to me. About tomorrow's service, I said, looking directly at my stepmother. I assume my ownership of the venue changes the terms of my invitation. Corinne's jaw tightened visibly. The funeral arrangements have already been finalized. Changing them now would be disruptive and disrespectful to the people who've planned to attend. I'm not asking to change the arrangements. I'm asking to attend my father's funeral as his daughter and as the owner of the facility hosting the service. The power dynamic on the Victorian porch had shifted so completely that it felt like we were all playing entirely new roles. This morning, Corinne had wielded the authority to exclude me from my father's goodbye. Now she was standing on property I owned, discussing a service that would be held in a building under my control. The reversal was so dramatic it would have been satisfying if it weren't happening in the context of my father's death. Derek stepped between us again, trying to diffuse the tension building in the autumn air. Maybe we should take some time to process all this information before making any decisions about tomorrow. Everyone's emotions are running high, and this news changes so many things. It doesn't change my right to say goodbye to my father, I said firmly. It doesn't change the fact that I loved him despite our complicated relationship. And it certainly doesn't change the fact that he apparently wanted me to continue his work, regardless of how anyone else feels about that decision. Patricia Vale gathered her documents and prepared to leave, clearly eager to escape the family drama she'd inadvertently unleashed. Miss Brennan, I'll have all the transition materials ready for our meeting tomorrow afternoon. We can schedule it for after the funeral service to give you time to process your grief before diving into business matters. After the funeral service. The phrase hung in the air like a challenge, daring Corinne to maintain her exclusion policy in the face of changed circumstances. I watched my stepmother's face cycle through various expressions as she calculated her options and their potential consequences. Fine, she said finally, her voice tight with controlled rage. Zara can attend the service, but I expect her to conduct herself with dignity and restraint. This is not the time or place for family drama or emotional outbursts. The conditional nature of her permission, as if she still held veto power over my grief, sparked something hot and fierce in my chest. Corinne, I've spent my entire adult life helping people navigate loss with dignity. I think I can manage to attend my own father's funeral without creating a scene. Uncle Pete squeezed my shoulder gently. Vincent would be proud of how you're handling this, sweetheart. He always said you had more strength and grace than you gave yourself credit for. The comment brought tears to my eyes for the first time since this surreal conversation began. Throughout all the legal revelations and family confrontations, I'd been operating on adrenaline and shock. But Uncle Pete's gentle reminder of my father's faith in me broke through the protective numbness I'd constructed around my emotions. My father had seen something in me that I'd forgotten was there. Despite the years of distance and misunderstanding, despite the way our relationship had become strained and careful, he'd recognized qualities I'd lost sight of during the long process of trying to fit into a family structure that never quite had room for me. He'd believed I could honor the Brennan legacy while also transforming it into something uniquely mine. As my family began to disperse from the porch, each lost in their own thoughts about how this news would reshape their futures, I remained standing in front of the building that was now mine. The October afternoon was fading into evening, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that complemented the Victorian architecture perfectly. This place had been home before it became complicated, sanctuary before it became battlefield, and now it would be both inheritance and opportunity. I pulled my phone from my purse and scrolled to my supervisor's contact information. As a grief counselor, I maintain strict boundaries about work-life balance. But this situation definitely qualified as extraordinary circumstances. I needed to discuss my caseload, explore options for remote sessions, and begin the complex process of potentially relocating my practice. The conversation would be difficult. Some clients had been working with me for years, building trust and making progress that could be disrupted by changes in our therapeutic relationship. But others might benefit from the integrated approach I was envisioning, receiving both funeral services and ongoing grief support from someone who understood both sides of the loss experience. My phone rang before I could place the call, and I saw Derek's name on the screen. He was probably already in his car, driving back to his apartment in West Hartford, processing everything that had happened, and trying to figure out how to navigate this new family landscape. "Zara, are you okay?" I know that was a lot to take in all at once. His concern sounded genuine, though I suspected it was complicated by worry about how the inheritance change might affect his own financial security. Derek had been working in marketing for a Hartford insurance company, a job he'd never seemed passionate about, but which provided steady income and benefits. The funeral home inheritance wouldn't directly impact his trust fund, but it certainly changed the family dynamics he'd grown accustomed to. "I'm still processing everything," I admitted, walking slowly around the building's perimeter. This morning I was a disinherited daughter who wasn't welcome at her father's funeral. Tonight I'm the owner of a 3-location funeral home business. It's not exactly what I expected when I drove down here this afternoon. "Are you really thinking about moving back to Millbrook? Giving up your practice in Hartford to run funeral homes?" The question in his voice wasn't entirely supportive, but it wasn't dismissive either. Derek had always been caught between his mother's narrative and his own observations, trying to maintain family peace while occasionally acknowledging uncomfortable truths. His concern might be genuine worry about my ability to handle such a dramatic life change. I'm thinking about a lot of things. Dad obviously put considerable thought into this decision, and I owe it to him and to myself to seriously consider what he envisioned. The idea of combining grief counseling with funeral services isn't just personally appealing, it could genuinely help families who are dealing with loss. Derek was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear him weighing his words carefully. "Mom's really upset about this, Zara. I've never seen her look so shaken. She's been talking for months about maybe expanding the business or renovating the main chapel, making plans based on the assumption that she'd be inheriting everything. Dad never promised her the business. She made assumptions based on her role as his wife, but apparently he had different plans for his professional legacy. I know, but try to see it from her perspective. She's been the face of the funeral home for 12 years. She's built relationships with clergy and cemetery directors and vendors. She's hosted industry events and managed the books and dealt with difficult families. In a lot of ways, she's been more involved in the day-to-day operations than Dad was toward the end." The defense of Corinne's contributions was fair, even if it stung to acknowledge. My stepmother had indeed been deeply involved in the business, probably more so than I'd recognized or wanted to admit. Her organizational skills and social connections had undoubtedly contributed to the funeral home's success and reputation. I'm not planning to dismiss her contributions or pretend she hasn't been important to the business, I said carefully. The transition period Dad arranged suggests he wanted her involved in teaching me what I'd need to know. But Derek, she literally tried to ban me from his funeral this morning. She spent years making it clear that she didn't consider me real family. I can't just pretend that history doesn't exist now that the inheritance has changed her circumstances. I get it. And honestly, the way she handled the funeral invitation was wrong. I should have spoken up about it at the time, but I was trying to avoid conflict during an already difficult situation. His admission surprised me. Derek rarely criticized his mother's decisions, even indirectly. The fact that he was acknowledging her mistake suggested the inheritance news had shaken his perspective on family dynamics as much as it had shifted the practical realities. What do you think Dad was trying to accomplish with this decision? Uncle Pete said he'd discussed his reasoning, but I'm still trying to understand what he was thinking. Derek sighed deeply. I think Dad felt guilty about how things played out after he married Mom. He could see that you were getting pushed to the edges of the family, but he didn't know how to fix it without creating conflict with his new wife. Maybe leaving you the business was his way of trying to restore your place in the family legacy. The insight felt both painful and healing simultaneously. If Derek's interpretation was correct, then my father's final gift wasn't just a business inheritance. It was an apology and an invitation to reclaim my identity as a Brennan. It was his acknowledgement that I belonged in the family story, not as a footnote or complication, but as the continuation of everything he'd worked to build. "Tomorrow is going to be complicated," I said, watching the last light fade from the October sky. "Yeah, it really is. But Zara, for what it's worth, I think you'll do good things with the business. You understand people in ways that most of us don't, and you care about helping others through difficult times. That's exactly what families need when they're dealing with loss." After we ended the call, I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the funeral home that would soon become my responsibility. The building looked different now, not just as a childhood memory or symbol of family tension, but as a place where I could build something meaningful. The combination of therapeutic support and funeral services could transform how families experienced loss, providing comprehensive care during one of life's most challenging transitions. My phone buzzed with a text from my supervisor responding to my earlier message. "Emergency meeting tomorrow morning at 8. This sounds like a significant life change that we need to discuss thoroughly." Significant life change was an understatement. In the span of a few hours, I'd gone from feeling like an outsider in my own family to becoming the heir to a multi-generational business. I discovered that my father's faith in me had been deeper and more enduring than I'd understood, and I'd inherited not just property and assets, but the opportunity to honor his memory while creating something uniquely my own. As I drove back toward Hartford, the Connecticut countryside looked different in the darkness. Instead of feeling like I was leaving behind a place where I'd never quite belonged, I felt like I was traveling between two versions of home. My apartment in Hartford represented the life I'd built independently, the professional identity I'd crafted through years of education and experience. But Millbrook now represented possibility, legacy, and the chance to merge my skills with my heritage in ways I'd never imagined. Tomorrow, I would attend my father's funeral as both his mourning daughter and the new owner of his life's work. I would sit in the front row of the chapel, where he'd taught me about dignity and service, surrounded by a community that had known me since childhood, but would now see me in an entirely different role. And after the service, I would begin the complex process of deciding how to honor both his memory and my own aspirations. The weight of that responsibility felt enormous, but for the first time in years, it also felt like exactly where I was meant to be. The morning of my father's funeral dawned gray and misty, the kind of October weather that makes everything look like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. I'd barely slept, spending most of the night alternating between reading through business documents Patricia Vale had emailed me and staring at the ceiling of my Hartford apartment, trying to process the magnitude of what lay ahead. My supervisor meeting at 8 had been both supportive and sobering. Dr. Rebecca Martinez had listened to my explanation with the kind of professional calm that comes from years of helping people navigate major life transitions. But I could see the concern in her eyes as I described my plans to potentially relocate and integrate my practice with funeral home services. "Zara, I want to support whatever decision you make, but I need you to consider the ethical implications carefully," she'd said, leaning forward across her desk. "Providing grief counseling to families who are also your funeral home clients could create dual relationships that might compromise therapeutic boundaries. You'd need to establish very clear protocols to avoid conflicts of interest." The warning was valid and something I'd already been wrestling with during my sleepless night. Professional ethics in therapy were non-negotiable, and I couldn't let my enthusiasm for innovation override my responsibility to provide appropriate care. But I also believed there had to be ways to structure services that would benefit families while maintaining therapeutic integrity. What if I partnered with other licensed counselors to provide the grief support services? I could oversee the program and handle administrative aspects while ensuring that families received counseling from therapists who weren't directly involved in their funeral arrangements. Dr. Martinez had nodded thoughtfully. "That could work. You'd essentially be creating a comprehensive bereavement center that operates alongside the funeral home, without creating dual relationships. It's ambitious, but it could fill a genuine need in your community. Her tentative approval had given me confidence that my vision wasn't just a grief-fueled fantasy, but a potentially viable approach to expanding mental health services in underserved rural areas. The drive back to Millbrook felt different this time, less like returning to a place of childhood wounds, and more like traveling toward a future I was actively choosing to create. The parking area around Eternal Rest Memorial Services was already filled when I arrived, with cars I recognized from my childhood, mixed with unfamiliar vehicles belonging to my father's professional colleagues and newer friends. I sat in my car for several minutes, watching people stream into the building that was now mine, trying to reconcile the surreal reality of my changed circumstances with the familiar grief of losing a parent. Uncle Pete appeared at my passenger window and tapped gently, his weathered face creased with concern. "You doing okay, sweetheart? I know this has to feel overwhelming on top of everything else." I climbed out and accepted his steadying presence, grateful for the one family member who'd consistently treated me with unconditional warmth. I keep expecting to wake up and discover this was all some strange dream. Yesterday morning I was banned from this funeral, and now I own the building. "Vincent always did have a flair for dramatic timing," Pete said with a sad smile. He probably would have enjoyed knowing how much this news shook up Corinne's carefully laid plans. We walked toward the building together, and I noticed how different the familiar space felt, now that I was seeing it through the lens of ownership rather than childhood memory. The Victorian architecture seemed less imposing and more welcoming, as if the building itself was inviting me to see it as home, rather than just a place I'd once visited. The main chapel was already 3/4 full, with people clustered in small groups speaking in the hushed tones appropriate for such occasions. I recognized faces from my childhood, neighbors and family friends who'd aged into softer versions of themselves, mixed with funeral industry professionals I didn't know but whose presence spoke to my father's reputation and standing in the community. Corinne stood near the front of the chapel, receiving condolences with the gracious composure she'd perfected over years of hosting social events. She wore an elegant black dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and her silver hair was arranged in a style that managed to look both formal and effortless. When she saw me enter, her expression flickered for just a moment before settling back into practiced serenity. Derek and Natalie were positioned strategically near their mother, flanking her like protective bookends. Both had inherited Corinne's ability to present perfect facades in public settings, but I could see the tension in their shoulders and the careful way they avoided looking directly at me. The inheritance revelation had clearly disrupted their sense of family hierarchy, and they were still processing how to navigate this new dynamic. I chose a seat in the third row, close enough to the front to honor my relationship with my father, but far enough back to avoid forcing uncomfortable proximity with my stepfamily. Several people I didn't recognize nodded politely as I settled into the pew, and I wondered if any of them knew about the inheritance drama that had unfolded on this same building's front porch less than 24 hours earlier. The service began promptly at 2 o'clock, conducted by Reverend Thomas Walsh, who'd baptized both me and Natalie and had officiated at my father's wedding to Corinne. His familiar voice filled the chapel as he spoke about Vincent Brennan's dedication to serving families during their most difficult moments, his commitment to treating every person with dignity regardless of their circumstances, and his deep love for the community that had shaped his life and career. Vincent often told me that working in funeral service wasn't just a job, it was a calling, Reverend Walsh said, his eyes moving across the assembled mourners. He believed that helping families say goodbye with grace and meaning was one of the most important services anyone could provide. He took pride in continuing a tradition that his grandfather had started, but he also understood that each generation must adapt that tradition to serve the changing needs of their community. The words resonated more deeply than they would have just days earlier. My father hadn't just been maintaining a family business, he'd been stewarding a legacy of service that required both continuity and evolution. His decision to leave me the funeral homes wasn't just about inheritance or family dynamics. It was about ensuring that legacy would continue to grow and adapt under someone who understood both its importance and its potential for innovation. When it came time for eulogies, Derek spoke first, sharing memories of fishing trips and baseball games, painting a picture of Vincent Brennan as a devoted stepfather who'd embraced his role in expanding the family. His words were heartfelt and genuine, focusing on the positive aspects of their relationship, without acknowledging the complexities that had shaped other family dynamics. Natalie followed, speaking eloquently about my father's professional achievements and community involvement. She highlighted his leadership in the Connecticut Funeral Directors Association, his mentorship of younger professionals, and his reputation for ethical business practices that had earned respect throughout the industry. Her eulogy was polished and appropriate, celebrating his public accomplishments while maintaining the careful emotional distance that had always characterized her relationship with difficult topics. When Reverend Walsh asked if anyone else wished to speak, the chapel fell silent. I felt the weight of expectation, the unspoken invitation to add my voice to the remembrance of my father's life. But I also felt the subtle tension from the front row, where Corinne sat rigid with the kind of controlled anxiety that suggested she was bracing for potential embarrassment or conflict. I stood slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me, and made my way to the podium. The chapel felt larger from this vantage point, filled with faces that represented different chapters of my father's life and various perspectives on his character and legacy. Some looked curious, others sympathetic, and a few appeared vaguely uncomfortable, as if they sensed undercurrents they couldn't quite identify. My relationship with my father was complicated, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the sound system. We didn't always understand each other, and we certainly didn't always agree. But what I learned yesterday, through his final gift to me, is that love and understanding don't require perfect communication or constant agreement. Sometimes they require faith in someone's potential even when that potential isn't immediately visible. I could see Corinne's face tightening, probably worried that I was about to air family grievances in front of the entire community. But my purpose was different, deeper than settling old scores or claiming public vindication. Vincent Brennan taught me that serving others during their most vulnerable moments is both a privilege and a responsibility. He showed me that treating people with dignity during loss and grief isn't just good business, it's good humanity. And through his decision to entrust me with continuing the family legacy, he demonstrated faith in my ability to honor those values while adapting them to serve our community's evolving needs. The chapel remained absolutely silent, with the kind of focused attention that occurs when people sense they're witnessing something significant. I could feel my father's presence in the room, not in any supernatural sense, but in the continuity between the values he'd embodied and the commitment I was making to carry them forward. I want everyone here to know that Eternal Rest Memorial Services will continue to provide the same compassionate professional care that families have relied on for 3 generations, but we'll also be expanding our services to include comprehensive grief support, recognizing that healing from loss requires more than just a beautiful funeral service. My father understood that death is not an ending but a transition, and our role is to help families navigate that transition with grace, support, and hope. When I returned to my seat, the silence continued for several seconds before Reverend Walsh resumed the service. I could feel eyes on me from various directions, some approving, others curious, and a few distinctly chilly. But for the first time in years, I felt completely aligned with my purpose and my place in the world. The graveside service was smaller and more intimate, limited to immediate family and closest friends. We stood in a semicircle around the casket as my father was laid to rest beside my mother in the section of Millbrook Cemetery reserved for longtime community families. The October air carried the scent of fallen leaves and the faint smoke of distant bonfires, creating an atmosphere that felt both melancholy and peaceful. As dirt was sprinkled over the casket and final prayers were offered, I found myself thinking not about endings but about beginnings. My father's death marked the conclusion of one chapter in the Brennan family story, but his legacy gift to me represented the opening of another. I was inheriting not just property and business assets, but the opportunity to redefine what it meant to serve families during life's most challenging transitions. After the graveside service concluded, people began dispersing toward their cars, but Patricia Vale approached me with the leather portfolio that had become so familiar over the past day. "Miss Brennan, are you ready for our transition meeting? I know this has been an emotionally demanding day, but I think you'll find the business information helpful as you begin planning your next steps." I nodded, suddenly eager to dive into the practical details that would transform my inheritance from abstract concept to concrete reality. Let's go to the funeral home. If I'm going to be working there, I should start getting comfortable in the office spaces. The drive back to eternal rest took only a few minutes, but it felt symbolic, like crossing a bridge between my old life and whatever was coming next. The building looked different in the late afternoon light, less like a childhood memory and more like a workplace where I would soon be making decisions that affected both families in crisis and employees who depended on the business for their livelihoods. Patricia led me to my father's office, a space I'd rarely entered during my childhood visits. The room was larger than I remembered, with windows overlooking the memorial garden and built-in bookcases filled with industry publications, legal references, and what appeared to be decades of funeral service journals. A massive oak desk dominated the center of the space, its surface carefully organized with file folders, a vintage desk lamp, and a framed photograph of my parents from their early married years. "Your father was meticulous about record-keeping," Patricia said, opening her portfolio and withdrawing several thick folders. "These files contain everything you'll need to understand the business operations. Financial statements going back 5 years, staff employment records, client service agreements, vendor contracts, and maintenance schedules for all 3 locations." The scope of information was overwhelming, but also reassuring. My father had built something substantial and well-organized, a business with systems and procedures that could continue functioning even during periods of transition. I wouldn't be starting from scratch or trying to impose order on chaos. I'd be stepping into an established operation that needed evolution rather than revolution. "What's the current financial status?" I asked, settling into the leather chair behind the desk that still smelled faintly of my father's cologne. "Very strong. The business generates consistent revenue from all 3 locations, with the Millbrook facility serving as the flagship and the Hartford and Waterbury locations providing steady satellite income. Your father was conservative with expenses and aggressive about maintaining cash reserves, so you'll have significant working capital available for improvements or expansion." Patricia spread financial statements across the desk, pointing to relevant figures and explaining the seasonal fluctuations in funeral home revenue. The business was indeed healthy, with profit margins that would support both my living expenses and reinvestment in facility improvements or service expansion. "What about staffing? I assume there are employees at all 3 locations who've been wondering about job security since Dad's death." 15 full-time employees across the 3 facilities, plus several part-time and on-call staff members. Most have been with the company for several years, and they're all licensed and experienced. Your father included provisions in the transition plan to ensure their continued employment during the adjustment period. The thoughtfulness of my father's planning continued to amaze me. He'd anticipated not just the legal and financial aspects of transferring the business, but also the human impact on employees who devoted their careers to working for Eternal Rest Memorial Services. His concern for their job security demonstrated the same compassion for people that had made him successful in serving grieving families. "I'd like to meet with the staff as soon as possible," I said, making notes on a legal pad I'd found in the desk drawer. "They need to hear directly from me that I'm committed to maintaining stable employment and continuing the quality of service they've helped build." Patricia nodded approvingly. "I think that's wise. Change can be unsettling, especially in a business where trust and consistency are so important to client relationships. Your background in counseling should help you communicate effectively about the transition." We spent the next 2 hours reviewing contracts with cemetery partnerships, relationships with clergy from various denominations, agreements with medical examiners and coroners, and the complex web of professional connections that kept a funeral home operating smoothly. The breadth of knowledge required was substantial, but I found myself remembering more from my teenage summers than I'd expected. "There's one more item we need to discuss," Patricia said as she gathered the financial documents back into organized piles. "Your stepmother's role during the transition period. The will specifies that she'll remain as interim manager for 6 months, but it doesn't define the exact parameters of that arrangement. You'll need to establish clear boundaries and expectations to avoid conflicts. The prospect of working closely with Corinne, especially after the hostility of the past day, felt daunting. But I also recognized that her knowledge of current operations and client relationships would be invaluable during my adjustment period. Managing this collaboration successfully would require setting aside personal grievances in favor of professional necessity. I'll schedule a meeting with her next week to discuss the transition structure. We need to establish clear rules and communication protocols that allow the business to function smoothly while I get up to speed on current operations. As Patricia prepared to leave, she handed me a set of keys that represented access to every aspect of my new responsibility. Your father would be proud of how you're approaching this, Miss Brennan. He often spoke about your intelligence and compassion, and he believed you had the strength to handle whatever challenges life presented. After she left, I sat alone in my father's office as evening shadows lengthened across the memorial garden. The silence felt different from the overwhelming quiet of grief. It felt pregnant with possibility, filled with the potential for creating something meaningful from the foundation he'd built. I opened the desk drawers systematically, familiarizing myself with their contents and discovering small personal items that revealed aspects of my father's character I'd never known. A collection of thank you notes from families he'd served. A photograph of me at age 8, helping him plant flowers in the memorial garden. A business card from Morrison Funeral Directors with handwritten notes about innovative grief support programs. In the bottom drawer, I found a sealed envelope with my name written in my father's careful script. My heart rate accelerated as I opened it, unsure what final message he might have left for me to discover. Zara, the letter began, if you're reading this, then you've accepted the responsibility I've placed on your shoulders, and Patricia has given you access to my private files. I want you to know that this decision wasn't made impulsively or out of disappointment with your stepfamily. It was made out of absolute confidence in your ability to take everything we've built and make it better. The letter continued for 2 pages, explaining his observations about my character, his belief in my innovative thinking, and his hope that I would find ways to modernize funeral services without losing sight of their fundamental purpose. He acknowledged the challenges I'd face, both practical and personal, and expressed faith that my combination of professional training and family heritage would serve me well. The business world will test you because you're young and because you're a woman entering a traditionally male-dominated industry, he wrote. Your stepfamily will test you because this inheritance shifts power dynamics they've grown comfortable with. But I've watched you help others navigate impossible situations with grace and wisdom, and I know you have the strength to handle whatever comes next. The final paragraph brought tears to my eyes. I'm sorry our relationship became complicated during my marriage to Corinne. I should have done better at maintaining our connection while building new family bonds. Consider this inheritance my attempt to restore what was damaged and give you the platform to create the legacy you were meant to build. I love you, and I believe in you completely. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my purse, a tangible reminder of my father's faith during moments when doubt might threaten to overwhelm me. The office felt less foreign now, more like a space where I could envision myself working and planning and building something meaningful. My phone buzzed with a text from Derek. How did the transition meeting go? Are you feeling overwhelmed by everything you're inheriting? I typed back, overwhelmed but excited. Dad built something really solid, and I think I can honor that while also expanding it in new directions. His response came quickly. I'm glad you're seeing the positive possibilities. For what it's worth, I think you're going to do great things with the business. And Zara, I'm sorry about how we handled everything yesterday. You deserved better from your family. The apology meant more than Derek probably realized. It suggested that the inheritance revelation had prompted him to reassess not just practical arrangements, but also the family dynamics that had shaped our relationships for years. Perhaps my father's final gift would create space for healing old wounds while building something new. As I locked the office and prepared to leave, I took one more look around the building that would soon become my daily workplace. The chapel where I'd attended my father's funeral this afternoon would host other services under my direction. The preparation rooms where generations of Brennans had cared for the deceased would continue that sacred work under my oversight. The memorial garden where families gathered for reflection would grow and evolve, as I learned to balance tradition with innovation. The drive back to Hartford felt different this time, not like leaving behind a place of complicated memories, but like commuting between two aspects of my expanding life. My apartment would remain my home while I planned the transition, but Millbrook was becoming something new, not just the town where I'd grown up, but the community where I would build my professional legacy and serve families during their most vulnerable moments. That night, I made lists of everything I needed to accomplish in the coming weeks. Updating my counseling licenses to practice in multiple locations, researching innovative funeral service programs, scheduling meetings with all staff members, and beginning the complex process of integrating grief support services with traditional funeral offerings. The scope of work was enormous, but for the first time in months I felt energized by challenge rather than daunted by it. My father's faith in me had created an opportunity to merge my professional passion with my family heritage in ways I'd never imagined possible. Tomorrow would begin the real work of proving that faith was justified, of transforming a traditional funeral home business into something that could serve families' comprehensive needs during loss and grief. The girl who'd been banned from her father's funeral was about to become the woman who would redefine how families experience death and remembrance in their community. 3 weeks after taking control of Eternal Rest Memorial Services, I discovered that my stepmother had been systematically embezzling from the business for over 2 years. The revelation came not through dramatic confrontation or suspicious behavior, but through the quiet diligence of Harold Kowalski, the company's longtime bookkeeper, who approached me with a manila folder full of irregularities he'd been afraid to bring to my father's attention during his illness. "Miss Brennan, I've been wrestling with this for months," Harold said, his weathered hands shaking slightly as he spread financial documents across my desk. "Your father trusted Mrs. Brennan completely, gave her full access to all accounts after his diagnosis. But these withdrawals, they don't match any business expenses I can identify." The numbers were staggering. $53,000 diverted over 18 months through a series of small transfers that would have been difficult to detect without careful analysis. Money taken from operational funds and disguised as vendor payments to companies that, upon closer inspection, appeared to be shell corporations registered to post office boxes. I stared at the evidence while my coffee grew cold, feeling a familiar sensation of having the ground shift beneath my feet. Just when I'd begun to find my footing as the new owner, just when I'd started to believe I could successfully honor my father's legacy, another family betrayal threatened to undermine everything I was working to build. "Harold, why didn't you bring this to Dad when you first noticed the irregularities?" The elderly bookkeeper removed his glasses and cleaned them nervously, a gesture I'd learned indicated serious discomfort. "Your father was fighting for his life, Miss Brennan. The treatments were hard on him, and he was depending on Mrs. Brennan to handle more and more of the daily operations." I kept thinking maybe there was an explanation I was missing, maybe she was covering legitimate expenses I didn't know about. The loyalty in his voice spoke to the kind of man my father had been, inspiring such devotion that employees would protect his peace of mind, even when faced with evidence of financial misconduct. But it also highlighted how Corinne had exploited both my father's illness and the trust of people who cared about him. "Do we have any idea where the money went?" Harold hesitated before answering, clearly uncomfortable with the implications of what he'd discovered. "Some of it appears to have funded renovations to the family residence, new kitchen appliances, bathroom fixtures, landscaping work. But there are also regular transfers to an account I can't trace, something that looks like it might be offshore, or at least out of state." The methodical nature of the theft made it worse somehow. This wasn't impulsive spending or momentary weakness. It was calculated fraud carried out over months, while my father was fighting cancer and trusting his wife to maintain the business that represented his life's work. I asked Harold to compile a comprehensive report detailing every questionable transaction, and I scheduled an appointment with Patricia Vale for the following morning. If Corinne had been stealing from the business, I needed legal advice about recovery options and potential criminal charges. More immediately, I needed to understand how this discovery would affect the transition period outlined in my father's will. That afternoon, I drove to the Hartford location to meet with Maria Santos, the facility manager there, and check on operations at our satellite office. The Hartford Funeral Home occupied a converted Victorian mansion in the West End. serving families who preferred the urban conveniences and diverse religious accommodations that weren't always available in smaller towns. Maria had been managing the Hartford location for 6 years, building relationships with multicultural communities, and establishing Eternal Rest as a funeral home that could accommodate various cultural and religious traditions. She was exactly the kind of innovative, community-focused professional I hoped to work with as I expanded grief counseling services. Ms. Brennan, I have to say, the staff has been curious about your plans for integrating mental health services, Maria said as we toured the facility's chapel and preparation areas. We see so many families who clearly need ongoing support beyond what we can provide during the immediate funeral planning period. That's exactly what I'm hoping to address. My background in grief counseling has shown me how much families struggle with the long-term process of adjusting to loss. Most people think healing happens naturally over time, but without proper support, grief can become complicated and interfere with people's ability to function. We discussed potential space configurations for counseling offices, logistics for scheduling services that wouldn't conflict with funeral activities, and strategies for training existing staff to recognize families who might benefit from additional support. Maria's enthusiasm for the expanded services was encouraging, and her practical insights helped me refine my vision for implementation. There's something else I wanted to mention, Maria said as we concluded our tour. Mrs. Brennan has been asking a lot of questions about our client payment systems and cash flow projections. She said she was helping you understand the business operations, but some of her questions seemed oddly specific about our internal financial processes. The comment sent a chill through me. If Corinne was attempting to manipulate financial records at the satellite locations as well, the scope of her misconduct could be far broader than Harold's initial discoveries had indicated. I made a mental note to have all 3 locations audited immediately. From now on, please direct any questions about financial operations to me directly. The transition period is creating some confusion about reporting structures, and I want to make sure all communication flows through appropriate channels. Maria nodded, clearly relieved to have clearer guidance about handling my stepmother's inquiries. Ms. Brennan, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but the staff is really excited about working for someone who understands both the business side and the emotional aspects of what we do. Your father was wonderful, but he was old school about keeping business and feelings separate. Your approach feels more holistic. The drive back to Millbrook gave me time to process Maria's observations along with Harold's disturbing financial revelations. My father's traditional approach to funeral services had been effective and respected, but it had also created opportunities for someone like Corinne to exploit the separation between operational and emotional aspects of the business. My integrated approach might prevent similar problems while also providing better service to families. That evening, I worked late in my father's office, now increasingly feeling like my office, reviewing personnel files and operational procedures for all 3 locations. The building was empty except for the security system's occasional beeps and the settling sounds of century-old wood responding to temperature changes. Around 9 o'clock, I heard the front door chime indicating someone had entered the building. Since the funeral home wasn't currently hosting any services, and I hadn't expected any visitors, the sound immediately put me on alert. I muted my computer and listened carefully, trying to identify the source of footsteps moving through the main hallway. Zara? Are you here? Corinne's voice carried through the building with that particular tone she used when she was trying to sound casual, while actually being quite deliberate about something. I saved the file I'd been working on and walked to the office door, finding my stepmother standing in the hallway wearing designer jeans and a cashmere sweater, looking like she'd just returned from some social engagement in West Hartford. Corinne. I wasn't expecting you this evening. Is there something urgent you needed to discuss? She moved closer with the confident stride of someone who'd spent years treating this building as her domain. I wanted to talk to you about the transition arrangements. I think we need to establish clearer boundaries about decision-making authority during the interim period. The timing of her visit, coming just hours after my discovery of the financial irregularities, felt far from coincidental. I wondered if Harold had mentioned our meeting to someone, or if Corinne had somehow sensed that her activities were being scrutinized more carefully. What kind of boundaries are you thinking about? She settled into one of the chairs across from my desk without being invited, crossing her legs and arranging herself as if preparing for a negotiation. I've been running the day-to-day operations of this business for months, while your father was ill. The staff is accustomed to taking direction from me, and the clients expect consistency in management approach. I'm concerned that your inexperience with current procedures might disrupt established relationships. The condescension in her voice was familiar, but it carried new weight now that I knew she'd been stealing from the business she claimed to be protecting. Her attempt to frame my learning process as disruptive seemed particularly audacious given what Harold had revealed about her financial misconduct. I appreciate your concern about continuity, but I'm confident that my background in working with grieving families will help me adapt to the operational aspects quickly. I've been meeting with staff members at all 3 locations, and they seem comfortable with the transition process. Corinne's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Yes, I heard you've been asking a lot of questions about financial procedures and internal processes. I hope you understand that some aspects of business operations are more complex than they might appear to someone without extensive experience in funeral home management. The barely veiled warning in her words confirmed my suspicion that she knew I was investigating the irregularities Harold had discovered. Her attempt to position my legitimate oversight as inexperienced meddling was both insulting and revealing. Actually, I've found the financial aspects quite straightforward. My background in running a counseling practice has given me solid experience with business operations, and I've been impressed by how well organized Dad kept everything. I watched her face carefully as I continued. In fact, I've been working with Harold to understand the complete financial picture, including cash flow patterns and expense categories. It's fascinating to see how consistent the business has been over the years, with just a few unusual fluctuations in the past 18 months. The color drained from Corinne's face so quickly that I wondered if she might actually faint. She recovered quickly, but not before I'd seen the flash of panic that confirmed Harold's suspicions about the missing money. Harold is getting old, Zara. Sometimes his attention to detail isn't what it used to be. I've been helping him with some of the more complex reconciliation work, which might explain any apparent irregularities in the records. The lie was smooth and plausible, exactly the kind of explanation that might have satisfied someone less familiar with financial analysis. But my experience in managing my own practice had taught me to recognize the difference between innocent mistakes and deliberate misdirection. That's interesting. Maybe you could help me understand some of the specific transactions he flagged. I have the documentation here if you'd like to review it together. Corinne stood abruptly, her composure slipping enough to reveal the calculation happening behind her carefully maintained facade. I don't think it's appropriate to be second-guessing financial decisions that were made during your father's illness. Vincent trusted me to handle these matters, and I acted in the business's best interests at all times. The defensive shift in her tone told me everything I needed to know about her awareness of the embezzlement. She wasn't confused or surprised by my questions. She was preparing to justify actions she knew were indefensible. I'm sure you did what you thought was appropriate. But as the new owner, I need to understand every aspect of the business operations, including financial decisions made during the transition period. I'm scheduling a comprehensive audit of all 3 locations, which should help clarify any areas of confusion. The word audit hit her like a physical blow. She gripped the back of the chair she'd been sitting in, knuckles white with tension, and I could see her mind racing through the implications of professional scrutiny of the books she'd been manipulating. An audit seems excessive, particularly given the additional stress it would place on staff members who are already adjusting to new ownership. Surely we can resolve any questions through internal review. The audit isn't negotiable, Corinne. It's standard practice when ownership changes hands, and it will provide baseline documentation for future financial planning. She stared at me for several seconds, clearly weighing her options and realizing that none of them were particularly favorable. The woman who'd wielded social authority and financial control for years was discovering that legal ownership trumped manipulative tactics. Fine. If you insist on treating family members like potential criminals, then I suppose that's your choice. But I want you to remember that I've devoted 12 years of my life to supporting your father and building this business. Everything I've done has been in service of preserving his legacy. Quote, The self-righteous indignation in her voice might have been convincing if I hadn't spent the day reviewing evidence of her systematic theft. Her attempt to reframe embezzlement as devotion to my father's memory was particularly galling. I'm not treating anyone like a criminal, Corinne. I'm conducting standard due diligence as a new business owner. If the audit reveals that all financial transactions were legitimate and properly documented, then we can move forward with confidence. If it reveals irregularities, then we'll address those appropriately. She gathered her purse and coat with sharp, angry movements, clearly abandoning any pretense of casual conversation. You know, Zara, your father worried that your tendency to see problems where none existed might make it difficult for you to trust the people who care about this business. I'm beginning to see what he meant. The attempt to use my father's supposed concerns against me was a particularly low manipulation, especially since I now had his letter expressing complete confidence in my judgment. But it also revealed how desperate Corinne was becoming, as she realized that intimidation and guilt weren't going to work the way they had when I was a powerless stepdaughter. My father left me this business because he trusted my judgment, including my ability to identify and address problems that might threaten its long-term success. I'm confident he would support thorough financial oversight during any ownership transition. After Corinne left, slamming the front door hard enough to rattle the vintage stained glass panels, I sat in the sudden silence trying to process the confrontation. The woman who'd tried to ban me from my father's funeral, who'd spent years making me feel like an unwelcome intruder in my own family, had been stealing from the business she claimed to be protecting. The irony was profound but also painful. While I'd been struggling to find my place in a family structure that consistently pushed me to the margins, Corinne had been systematically looting the legacy my father had worked his entire life to build. Her theft wasn't just financial. It was a betrayal of every value my father had embodied in his approach to serving families and maintaining trust within the community. I called Patricia Vale's after-hours number and left a detailed voicemail about the evening's conversation and Corinne's reaction to the audit announcement. If she was planning to destroy evidence or manipulate records further, we needed to move quickly to protect whatever documentation still existed. That night, I barely slept, my mind cycling through implications and strategies for handling a situation that had grown far more complex than simple business transition. By morning, I decided that confronting Corinne privately about the theft would be pointless. She'd already demonstrated her willingness to lie and manipulate rather than take responsibility for her actions. The audit Patricia arranged moved forward with ruthless efficiency. Within a week, forensic accountants had documented not just the $53,000 Harold had initially identified, but an additional $37,000 in fraudulent transactions dating back nearly 3 years. The total theft of $90,000 represented a significant chunk of the business's operational reserves and had been hidden through increasingly sophisticated manipulation of vendor accounts and client payment processing. More damaging than the money itself was the breach of trust Corinne's actions represented. Funeral homes operate on the foundation of community confidence. Families trust directors with their most precious and vulnerable moments, and any suggestion of financial impropriety could destroy reputation and relationships that had taken generations to build. The day the audit report was finalized, I scheduled a meeting with Derek and Natalie at the funeral home. They needed to hear about their mother's misconduct directly from me, and I needed to understand whether they'd been aware of or complicit in her activities. Both arrived punctually, but their body language suggested they'd already heard rumors about the investigation. Derek looked exhausted, like he'd been losing sleep over possibilities he didn't want to contemplate. Natalie maintained her lawyer composure, but I could see the tension in the way she gripped her briefcase handle. "Thank you both for coming. I have some difficult information to share about financial irregularities we've discovered in the business accounts." I walked them through the audit findings methodically, showing documentation of fraudulent transfers and explaining how the money had been diverted from operational funds. Neither interrupted or asked questions until I'd finished presenting the complete scope of their mother's theft. "How certain are you that Mom knew these transfers were inappropriate?" Derek asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The pattern of activity makes innocent mistake impossible. The transactions were carefully structured to avoid detection, routed through shell companies, and timed to correspond with periods when your father was most focused on his medical treatments. This was deliberate, systematic embezzlement." Natalie had remained silent throughout my presentation, but now she looked directly at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "What are your intentions regarding prosecution? Are you planning to press criminal charges?" The question I'd been dreading because it forced me to balance justice against family dynamics that were already fractured beyond easy repair. Corinne deserved to face consequences for her actions, but criminal proceedings would create public scandal that could damage the funeral home's reputation and hurt innocent employees. I haven't made final decisions about criminal charges. My immediate priority is recovering the stolen money and ensuring that nothing like this can happen again. But I want both of you to understand that your mother stole nearly $100,000 from a business she was supposed to be helping protect. Derek buried his face in his hands, clearly overwhelmed by the confirmation of suspicions he'd probably been harboring for weeks. I knew something was wrong. The new kitchen, the landscaping, the European vacation she took last spring. It all seemed expensive for someone living on Dad's life insurance and investment income. "Did you ever ask her about the source of funding for those purchases?" I tried to, but she got defensive and said it was none of my business how she managed her inheritance. I thought maybe Dad had left her more than I realized, or maybe she'd been more successful with her own investments. Natalie was taking notes in the margins of the audit report, her legal training evident in the systematic way she was processing the information. "Zara, I need you to know that neither Derek nor I had any knowledge of these financial irregularities. If we had suspected anything, we would have brought it to your attention immediately." The sincerity in her voice was convincing, and I found myself believing that Corinne had acted alone in her theft. The revelation seemed to be genuinely shocking both of my half-siblings, suggesting that she'd hidden her activities even from her own children. "What happens now?" Derek asked, finally looking up from his hands. "Now we focus on protecting the business and serving our clients. The stolen money represents a significant loss, but it won't threaten the operational stability of Eternal Rest. I've implemented new financial controls and oversight procedures that will prevent similar problems in the future." "And Mom?" The simple question carried enormous weight. Derek wasn't just asking about legal consequences or financial recovery. He was asking about family relationships and whether there was any path forward that could preserve connections between people who'd shared decades of complicated history. "Your mother will need to face the consequences of her choices. The exact nature of those consequences will depend partly on her willingness to cooperate with recovery efforts and take responsibility for what she's done." As Derek and Natalie left the funeral home that afternoon, both looking older and more burdened than they had an hour earlier, I reflected on how completely the family dynamics had shifted since my father's death. The woman who'd tried to exclude me from his funeral had become the source of the greatest threat to his legacy. The inheritance I'd never expected to receive had become the foundation for rebuilding trust and integrity in a business that had been compromised by the person supposedly protecting it. That evening, I called Uncle Pete to update him on the audit findings. He listened without interruption, occasionally sighing heavily as I detailed the scope of Corinne's theft. "Your father would be heartbroken," he said when I finished, "not just about the money, but about the betrayal of trust." Vincent built his reputation on absolute integrity, and knowing that his own wife was stealing from families who trusted him with their most precious moments would have devastated him. I keep thinking about that. How do I tell clients that money they paid for services was diverted to fund someone's personal luxury purchases? How do I rebuild trust when the person they counted on to protect their interests was actively stealing from them? Uncle Pete was quiet for several moments before responding. "You rebuild trust the same way Vincent built it in the first place. One family at a time, one service at a time, by demonstrating that you'll put their needs above your own interests every single time. People will judge you based on your actions, not on what Corinne did while she was stealing from them." His words provided both comfort and clarity about the path forward. The scandal of Corinne's theft could destroy everything my father had built, or it could become the foundation for demonstrating new leadership that was even more committed to integrity and transparency than previous generations had been. The next morning brought a registered letter from Corinne's attorney, proposing a settlement agreement that would provide partial restitution in exchange for avoiding criminal prosecution. The offer was accompanied by a statement claiming that any financial irregularities had been the result of bookkeeping errors and misunderstandings rather than intentional theft. I forwarded the letter to Patricia Vale and scheduled a meeting to discuss response options. The settlement offer confirmed that Corinne understood the seriousness of her legal exposure, But her continued refusal to accept responsibility for her actions made me less inclined toward leniency. The woman who'd tried to erase me from family photos and exclude me from my father's farewell was about to learn that ownership came with the power to demand accountability. And unlike the powerless stepdaughter she'd spent years marginalizing, the new owner of Eternal Rest Memorial Services had both the legal authority and the moral obligation to protect my father's legacy from anyone who threatened to exploit it. 6 months later, I stood in the renovated conference room at Eternal Rest Memorial Services, watching as the Connecticut Funeral Directors Association presented our business with their Innovation in Compassionate Care Award. The recognition celebrated our new integrated grief support program, which had already helped over 60 families navigate the complex process of healing after loss. The irony wasn't lost on me that Corinne, who'd once dismissed my professional background as irrelevant to funeral home operations, had inadvertently created the circumstances that led to this recognition. Her criminal trial for embezzlement had concluded 3 weeks earlier with a guilty plea and a sentence of 18 months in minimum security prison, plus full restitution of the $90,000 she'd stolen. More importantly, her prosecution had sent a clear message to the community that the new leadership at Eternal Rest would prioritize transparency and accountability above family loyalty or personal comfort. The settlement negotiations had been brutal and revealing. Corinne's initial offer of partial restitution in exchange for avoiding prosecution had evolved through several counterproposals before she finally accepted that I wasn't interested in protecting her reputation at the expense of justice. Her attorney had tried every angle from family unity arguments to business reputation concerns, but Patricia Vale had methodically dismantled each attempt to minimize the consequences of systematic theft. The breaking point had come when Corinne's legal team attempted to argue that her actions had been motivated by financial insecurity following my father's death, painting her as a grieving widow who'd made poor choices under emotional duress. The narrative might have been compelling if not for the timeline evidence showing that her theft had begun nearly a year before my father's terminal diagnosis, during a period when the business was generating record profits and her personal financial situation was entirely stable. Derek and Natalie had both provided statements supporting full prosecution, a decision that couldn't have been easy given their complicated loyalties. Derek's statement had been particularly powerful, describing how his mother's actions had betrayed not just the business, but also the memory of the stepfather who'd trusted her completely. Natalie's legal background had helped her craft testimony that was both emotionally honest and professionally devastating to any defense strategy based on innocent misunderstanding. The trial itself had lasted only 3 days. Corinne's attorney had advised her to accept a plea agreement, rather than face a jury with the overwhelming evidence of premeditated fraud that forensic accountants had assembled. Her allocution before the judge had been brief and grudging, accepting responsibility for financial irregularities without acknowledging the systematic nature of her theft or its impact on the families who'd trusted her with their most vulnerable moments. Watching her led away in handcuffs had been surreal rather than satisfying. The woman who'd once wielded social authority and financial control was reduced to an orange jumpsuit and ankle shackles. Her carefully constructed public persona collapsed entirely. But more than justice served, I felt relief that the business could finally move forward without the shadow of unresolved corruption hanging over every decision and relationship. The aftermath of Corinne's conviction had created opportunities I hadn't anticipated. Several funeral homes in the region had reached out to learn about our new grief support services, recognizing that comprehensive care could differentiate their businesses in an increasingly competitive market. The publicity around our innovative approach, combined with the transparency we demonstrated in handling the embezzlement scandal, had actually enhanced rather than damaged our reputation within the professional community. The expansion had required careful planning and significant investment. I'd partnered with 3 other licensed grief counselors to provide services across all locations, ensuring that families could receive therapeutic support without creating dual relationships that might compromise treatment effectiveness. The program offered both individual and group counseling, with specialized tracks for different types of loss: sudden death, prolonged illness, suicide, and death by violence. What surprised me most was how readily traditional funeral home clients had embraced the mental health component. I'd expected resistance from older community members or families with conservative approaches to emotional expression, but the opposite had proven true. People who might never have sought counseling in clinical settings felt comfortable accepting support when it was integrated into funeral services they already trusted and valued. Mrs. Eleanor Richardson, whose husband had died of complications from Alzheimer's disease, had become one of our most enthusiastic advocates for the grief counseling program. At 83, she'd never spoken to a mental health professional before, but she'd participated in our caregiver support group and had experienced significant relief from the guilt and exhaustion that had accumulated during years of watching her husband's cognitive decline. Zara helped me understand that feeling angry about Harold's illness wasn't the same as being angry at Harold. Mrs. Richardson had told the Millbrook Gazette reporter, who'd written a feature story about our expanded services. I'd been carrying guilt about resenting the disease for so long that I couldn't properly mourn the man I'd loved for 58 years. Stories like hers had multiplied throughout the community as word spread about the comprehensive support available through Eternal Rest. Families who'd completed traditional funeral services months or years earlier were returning to participate in grief counseling groups, finding community with others who understood the ongoing challenges of adjusting to loss. The financial impact had been substantial as well. The integrated grief support services generated additional revenue that more than offset the money Corinne had stolen, and the enhanced reputation had attracted families from beyond our traditional geographic service area. The Hartford location, in particular, had seen growth in culturally diverse clientele, who appreciated our holistic approach to honoring different traditions while providing universal emotional support. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, my former supervisor, had become a consulting partner in developing our clinical protocols and training programs. Her expertise in ethical mental health practice had been invaluable in creating systems that maintained professional boundaries while maximizing therapeutic benefit for families in crisis. "What you've built here represents the future of grief support services," she'd said during her most recent site visit. "The artificial separation between practical funeral arrangements and emotional healing has never served families well. Your integrated approach addresses the reality that death affects every aspect of human experience, not just the logistical details of burial and memorialization." The recognition from professional organizations had validated our approach, but more meaningful feedback had come from families who'd experienced our services during their most difficult moments. Thank you letters filled an entire filing cabinet, describing how grief counseling had helped people return to work, repair strained relationships, and find meaning in loss that had initially seemed senseless and overwhelming. One letter that particularly moved me had come from Marcus Williams, whose teenage son had died in a car accident 6 months earlier. Marcus had initially resisted any suggestion of counseling, insisting that grief was private and that talking about his son's death wouldn't bring him back. But after participating in our father's grief support group, he'd written to describe how connecting with other men who'd lost children had probably saved his marriage and helped him maintain relationships with his surviving daughter. "You gave me permission to feel everything I was feeling without judgment," his letter had concluded. "In our family, men weren't supposed to cry or admit weakness, but losing Jalen broke something in me that needed professional help to heal. Thank you for making that help available in a place where I already felt comfortable asking for support." The success of the grief counseling program had also created opportunities for community education and prevention services. We'd begun offering workshops on advanced care planning, helping families have difficult conversations about end-of-life preferences before crisis situations made communication more challenging. The workshops had been so popular that we'd expanded to offer them at senior centers, religious congregations, and community centers throughout our service area. Uncle Pete had become one of our most effective volunteer facilitators for the advanced care planning workshops, bringing his teaching background and natural warmth to discussions that many people found intimidating or depressing. His ability to inject appropriate humor into serious topics helped participants engage with material they might otherwise avoid. "Your father would have been amazed by what you've accomplished," he'd told me after a particularly successful workshop at the Millbrook Community Center. "He believed in serving families during their most difficult moments, but I don't think he ever imagined that service could extend so far beyond traditional funeral arrangements." The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Some longtime clients had initially questioned whether mental health services belonged in a funeral home setting, worried that therapy might somehow diminish the dignity or solemnity they expected from memorial services. I'd addressed these concerns through individual conversations and community presentations, explaining how grief counseling enhanced rather than replaced traditional approaches to honoring the deceased. The staff adjustment period had been complex as well. Funeral directors and embalmers who'd focused exclusively on logistical and ceremonial aspects of their work needed training to recognize signs of complicated grief and understand appropriate referral processes. The learning curve had been steep, but most employees had embraced the expanded mission once they saw how much difference comprehensive support could make for struggling families. Harold Kowalski, the bookkeeper who'd first alerted me to Corinne's embezzlement, had become an unexpected champion of the new services. His wife had died 2 years before my father, and he'd struggled with isolation and depression that he'd hidden from colleagues who saw him only in his professional role. When I'd encouraged him to participate in our widowers support group, he'd initially been skeptical about sharing personal struggles with other men from the community. I thought grief counseling was for people who couldn't handle things on their own, he'd admitted during a staff meeting where we discussed the program's first-year outcomes. But learning that other men were having the same struggles with loneliness and purpose made me feel less broken. Now I recommend the support groups to every widower we serve, because I know how much difference it can make. Quote, the financial audit that had revealed Corinne's theft had also identified opportunities for operational improvements that had strengthened the business in unexpected ways. Streamlined accounting procedures, enhanced internal controls, and regular financial reporting had created transparency that built trust with both employees and clients. Several families had commented that they felt more confident choosing eternal rest specifically because we demonstrated willingness to address problems honestly rather than concealing them for appearance's sake. The new oversight systems had also enabled expansion that would have been impossible under the previous management structure. We'd opened a 4th location in New Britain, serving families in a diverse urban community that had previously lacked access to funeral services that honored different cultural and religious traditions. The New Britain facility included a dedicated grief counseling center with group meeting spaces, individual therapy offices, and specialized areas for children's bereavement programs. Working with grieving children had become one of my favorite aspects of the expanded services. Traditional funeral homes often struggled to accommodate young people whose emotional expressions didn't match adult expectations for appropriate mourning behavior. Our children's programs used art therapy, play therapy, and age-appropriate counseling techniques to help kids process loss in ways that honored their developmental needs, rather than forcing them into adult models of grief. 8-year-old Sofia Martinez had become the inspiration for our children's program expansion. Her grandmother had died of COVID complications during the pandemic, and Sofia's parents had brought her to their first family counseling session because she'd been having nightmares and refusing to attend school. Through art therapy and play-based interventions, Sofia had been able to express fears about death and abandonment that she couldn't articulate in words. 6 months later, Sofia had created a memorial garden drawing that we'd used in our promotional materials, showing her grandmother surrounded by flowers and butterflies, with text that read, "Abuela is still with me in the beautiful things." Her parents had written that the counseling program had not only helped Sofia process her grief, but had also taught them how to support her ongoing emotional needs, as she continued growing up without her grandmother's physical presence. The success with pediatric grief support had attracted attention from school districts and pediatric healthcare providers who'd been struggling to address children's mental health needs during the pandemic. We'd developed consultation relationships with several elementary schools, providing grief education for teachers and crisis intervention services when students experienced significant losses. The community impact had extended beyond our direct service provision as well. The visibility of our grief counseling programs had reduced stigma around mental health support throughout the Millbrook area, making it easier for people to seek help for various psychological challenges. Local physicians had begun referring patients to our counselors for bereavement support, recognizing that untreated grief could complicate medical conditions and interfere with physical healing. Dr. Sarah Kim, a family practice physician who'd become one of our most consistent referral sources, had described the collaboration as transformative for her patient care. Before Eternal Rest expanded their services, I had grieving patients who clearly needed professional support, but the nearest grief counselors were 40 minutes away and had waiting lists of several months. Now I can refer people to high-quality therapy that's geographically accessible and specifically designed for their needs. The professional recognition had culminated in an invitation to present our integrated service model at the National Funeral Directors Association annual conference, scheduled for the following spring in Chicago. The presentation would provide an opportunity to share our approach with funeral directors from across the country, potentially influencing how the industry conceptualized its role in supporting families beyond immediate burial and memorial services. Preparing for the national presentation had required documenting our methods and outcomes in ways that could be replicated by other funeral homes with different resources and community characteristics. The process had been challenging, but had also clarified which aspects of our approach were essential to success, and which were specific to our particular circumstances and clientele. The documentation process had also revealed how significantly my own professional identity had evolved since inheriting the business. I'd begun as a grief counselor who happened to own funeral homes, but I'd gradually become someone who saw funeral service and grief support as inseparable aspects of comprehensive end-of-life care. The transformation had been organic rather than planned, driven by client needs and community response rather than theoretical models or professional ambitions. Derek and Natalie had both played important roles in the business expansion, though in ways I hadn't initially anticipated. Derek's marketing background had been invaluable in developing communication strategies that explained our services, without creating confusion about the relationship between traditional funeral arrangements and grief counseling. His ability to craft messaging that was both informative and sensitive had helped us reach families who needed support but might have been intimidated by purely clinical approaches to mental health services. Natalie's legal expertise had been crucial in navigating the regulatory complexities of operating integrated funeral and mental health services. Licensing requirements, insurance considerations, and professional liability issues had required careful attention to ensure that our innovative approach didn't create unexpected legal vulnerabilities. Her willingness to provide pro bono consultation during the startup phase had saved thousands of dollars in legal fees while ensuring compliance with all applicable regulations. Both of my half-siblings had also provided personal testimony about the positive impact of grief counseling on their own adjustment to losing their stepfather and dealing with their mother's criminal behavior. Their public support had helped legitimize mental health services within our conservative community, demonstrating that successful, educated people could benefit from professional emotional support during difficult life transitions. The relationship healing that had occurred between Derek, Natalie, and me had been unexpected but profound. Our shared experience of discovering Corinne's theft and witnessing her prosecution had created common ground that years of family therapy probably couldn't have achieved. We'd learned to see each other as individuals rather than representatives of different loyalty positions, and we developed genuine friendships based on mutual respect rather than family obligation. Derek had recently accepted a position as marketing coordinator for all Eternal Rest locations, bringing his professional skills to bear on promoting our expanded services throughout the region. His decision to leave his insurance company job had surprised everyone, including himself, but he described feeling called to work that had clear social benefit rather than purely commercial purpose. I spent 5 years selling insurance products that most people hoped they'd never need to use, he'd explained when announcing his career change. Now I'm promoting services that help families heal from the worst experiences of their lives. The work feels meaningful in ways my previous job never did. Natalie had remained in her law firm position but had become our primary legal counsel, handling everything from employment contracts to regulatory compliance issues. Her involvement had evolved from crisis management during Corinne's prosecution to ongoing partnership in business development and strategic planning. Working with Eternal Rest has reminded me why I went to law school in the first place, she'd said during our most recent planning meeting. I wanted to help people navigate complex systems during vulnerable moments in their lives. Corporate law pays better, but family law feels more important. Uncle Pete had become our unofficial community liaison, using his decades of teaching relationships and local knowledge to identify families who might benefit from our services but were reluctant to ask for help directly. His gentle approach and trusted reputation had opened doors that professional marketing couldn't have accessed, particularly among older residents who valued personal recommendations over advertising messages. Pete's been our secret weapon, Harold had observed during a staff meeting. He knows everybody in 3 counties, and when he tells someone they might benefit from grief counseling, They listen because they trust his judgment completely. The personal growth I'd experienced throughout the transformation process had been as significant as the professional achievements. The powerless stepdaughter who'd been banned from her father's funeral had become a confident business owner who'd rebuilt family relationships while creating innovative services that genuinely helped people heal from loss. The journey had required learning to wield authority without becoming authoritarian, to demand accountability without sacrificing compassion, and to honor tradition while embracing change. The lessons had been learned through trial and error rather than theoretical study, but they'd proven applicable to both business management and personal relationships. Most importantly, I discovered that my father's final gift hadn't just been the funeral home inheritance, but the opportunity to create something uniquely meaningful by combining my professional training with my family heritage. The integrated grief support services represented innovation that honored the past while serving contemporary needs, exactly the kind of evolution that sustainable family businesses require to remain relevant across generations. The evening of the awards ceremony, I drove through Millbrook's familiar streets, thinking about how completely my life had changed since that October morning, when Corinne had tried to exclude me from my father's funeral. The town looked the same, but my relationship to it had been fundamentally transformed. Instead of feeling like an outsider visiting the place where I'd grown up, I felt like someone who belonged to the community and contributed meaningfully to its well-being. The Victorian funeral home building had been renovated and expanded, but retained its historic character and welcoming atmosphere. The memorial garden had been redesigned to include meditation spaces and children's play areas, recognizing that healing happened differently for different age groups and personality types. The interior spaces balanced professional therapy office requirements with the dignity and serenity families expected from funeral home environments. At home in my apartment above the funeral home, I'd moved from Hartford 6 months earlier. I reviewed the speech I'd prepared for the awards ceremony. The recognition was gratifying, but more meaningful was the knowledge that dozens of families had experienced better outcomes because of the services we'd developed. The integration of grief counseling with funeral arrangements had proven beneficial not just theoretically, but practically, in measurable ways that improved people's lives during their most challenging moments. The next morning brought a phone call that reminded me why the work mattered so deeply. Mrs. Richardson, whose participation in our caregiver support group had helped her process complicated grief around her husband's Alzheimer's disease, was calling to thank me for helping her find meaning in loss that had initially felt senseless and overwhelming. "Zara, I wanted you to know that I'm volunteering at the Alzheimer's support group at the hospital now," she said, her voice bright with purpose. "I'm using what I learned in your grief counseling program to help other wives who are watching their husbands disappear piece by piece. Your father would be so proud of what you've built here." Her words captured exactly what I hoped the business would become. Not just a place where people came during crisis, but a foundation for ongoing community healing and support that extended far beyond individual family emergencies. The integrated approach had created ripple effects that strengthened the entire social fabric of our region, helping people develop resilience and compassion that benefited everyone they encountered. As I prepared for another day of serving families during their most difficult moments, I thought about the letter my father had left in his desk drawer, expressing faith in my ability to take everything he'd built and make it better. His confidence had been validated not just by business success or professional recognition, but by the tangible improvement in how families experienced loss and healing in our community. The daughter who'd been erased from family photos and excluded from funeral planning had become someone who helped others feel seen and supported during their darkest hours. The inheritance that had seemed impossible had become the foundation for work that honored both my professional calling and my family legacy. Walking through the funeral home that morning, checking on staff preparations for the day's services and reviewing the schedule of grief counseling appointments, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from discovering your true purpose. The building that had once represented childhood wounds and family conflict had become home, workplace, and mission, all combined into something larger than I'd ever imagined possible. My father's final gift hadn't just been property and assets, but the opportunity to prove that love and faith could triumph over betrayal and exclusion. The woman who'd tried to ban me from his funeral had ultimately enabled me to honor his memory more completely than traditional inheritance ever could have achieved. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.